The alarm bells screamed through the Soviet submarine base like wounded animals. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov rushed through the corridors of the secret facility, his heart pounding against his ribs. September 26, 1983. Started like any other day, but the world was about to balance on the edge of a knife. The massive steel doors of the command center slid open with a mechanical hiss. Inside, dozens of military personnel hunched over glowing screens, their faces painted green by the radar displays. The air smelled of cigarettes, sweat, and fear. Petrov took his position at the main console, unaware that within hours, he would hold the fate of every living person on Earth in his hands. The Cold War had turned the planet into a powder keg. Ronald Reagan sat in the White House while Leonid Brezhnev ruled from the Kremlin. Nuclear missiles pointed at major cities from both sides of the Iron Curtain. Everyone knew that if one side launched their weapons, the other would respond within minutes. Total destruction would follow. Petrov adjusted his uniform and checked his watch. His job was simple but crucial: monitor the early warning systems that watched the skies for incoming American missiles. If the computers detected an attack, he would have 15 minutes to report it up the chain of command. Those 15 minutes would decide whether the Soviet Union launched its own nuclear arsenal in response. The technology was new and impressive. Satellites orbited high above the Earth, scanning the American missile bases with infrared sensors. These electronic eyes could spot the heat signature of launching rockets from thousands of miles away. The data flowed back to computers that analyzed every signal, every flash of light, every suspicious movement. But technology was only as reliable as the people who operated it. And people made mistakes. The morning hours crawled by with routine, reports, and system checks. Petrov sipped his coffee and reviewed intelligence briefings about American military movements. Relations between the superpowers had grown especially tense after the Soviets shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 just weeks earlier, killing 269 innocent passengers. The Americans were furious. Some Soviet leaders worried that the United States might use this incident as an excuse to launch a first strike. At exactly 12:15 p.m., everything changed. The warning system erupted in flashing red lights and deafening sirens. Petrov's coffee cup shattered on the floor as he lunged toward his console. The main screen displayed a message that made his blood run cold. Missile launch detected. Confidence level maximum. According to the computers, an American intercontinental ballistic missile had just lifted off from a base in Montana. The weapon was traveling at over 15,000 miles per hour toward Soviet territory. Impact would occur in approximately 28 minutes. The room exploded into controlled chaos. Officers shouted coordinates and technical data. Phones rang incessantly as various departments demanded updates. Someone screamed for the secure line to Moscow. The protocol was clear. Petrov had to immediately notify his superiors that World War III had begun. But something felt wrong. Petrov stared at the screen, his mind racing. If the Americans were really launching a nuclear attack, why would they fire only one missile? Military doctrine called for massive strikes with hundreds of weapons to overwhelm Soviet defenses. A single missile made no strategic sense. It would only guarantee devastating retaliation while failing to cripple Soviet nuclear forces. The computer insisted the threat was real. The satellite data showed all the signatures of an authentic launch: the heat plume, the trajectory, the speed. Every technical indicator pointed to an incoming nuclear weapon. Standard procedure demanded that he pick up the red phone and report the attack within 2 minutes of detection. His hand hovered over the receiver. Around him, junior officers waited for orders. Their training had drilled into them that hesitation could doom the motherland. Every second of delay gave the American missile more time to reach its target. If this attack was the beginning of a coordinated strike, the Soviet Union needed to launch its own missiles immediately to have any chance of survival. Petrov closed his eyes and tried to think clearly. The weight of 280 million Soviet citizens pressed down on his shoulders. Beyond his own country, he thought about the billions of people worldwide who would die if nuclear war erupted. Cities would vanish in mushroom clouds. Radiation would poison the air and water. Civilization itself might not survive. The alarm continued its relentless shrieking. The countdown showed 25 minutes to impact. His commanding officers would arrive soon, demanding to know why he had not yet reported the attack. Court, martial and execution awaited anyone who failed in their duty during a nuclear crisis. But what if the computers were wrong? Stanislav Petrov's finger trembled above the red phone. 23 minutes until impact. The computer screens bathed the command center in hellish red light as sirens wailed their warning of approaching doom. Every instinct screamed at him to follow protocol and report the incoming missile. But his gut told him something was terribly wrong. The early warning system had cost the Soviet Union billions of rubles and represented the finest military technology available. Teams of engineers had spent years perfecting the satellite network and computer systems. The margin of error was supposed to be virtually zero. Yet Petrov could not shake the feeling that the machines were lying to him. He thought about his training at the military academy. His instructors had emphasized that American nuclear strategy relied on overwhelming first strikes. If the United States decided to attack, they would launch hundreds of missiles simultaneously to destroy Soviet command centers, missile silos, and major cities before retaliation was possible. The Americans understood that any nuclear exchange would likely escalate to total war, so they would not waste their advantage with a limited attack. A single missile made no military sense whatsoever. The secure communications panel lit up with incoming calls from Moscow. High-ranking generals and political leaders were demanding immediate updates on the situation. Petrov's direct superior, Colonel Ivan Sidorov, burst through the command center doors with sweat streaming down his face. "What is the status?" Sidorov shouted over the alarms. "Why have you not reported this attack?" Petrov met his commander's eyes. "Sir, I believe the system is malfunctioning. The computers show only one missile, which contradicts all American nuclear doctrine." "The computers are not wrong." Sidorov slammed his fist on the console. "You see the data yourself. Heat signature, trajectory, velocity. Everything confirms an intercontinental ballistic missile launched from Montana. You must report this immediately." "Colonel, if I am correct, and this is a false alarm, my report will trigger our own launch sequence. Thousands of nuclear weapons will be fired at American cities. Hundreds of millions of innocent people will die for nothing." The room fell silent except for the persistent shriek of warning sirens. Every person in the command center understood the implications. Once the Soviet Union reported an incoming attack, their leaders would have no choice but to respond with massive retaliation. The nuclear exchange would spread across the globe within hours, potentially ending human civilization. Sidorov's face had gone pale. He was a career military officer who had followed orders without question for 30 years. But he also understood that Petrov was asking him to gamble with the survival of their entire nation. If the computers were correct and they failed to report the attack, an American nuclear weapon would detonate on Soviet soil while their forces sat unprepared. "You have 2 minutes to make this decision," Sidorov said quietly. "Then I will make it for you." Petrov turned back to his screens and studied the technical data more carefully. The satellite had detected infrared radiation consistent with rocket exhaust, but something about the readings seemed odd. The heat signature was too clean, too perfect. Real missile launches produced more irregular patterns due to atmospheric interference and mechanical variations in the rockets themselves. Suddenly, a new possibility occurred to him. What if the satellite had mistaken sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds for the heat plume of a missile launch? The angle of the sun at this time of day could create false readings under certain atmospheric conditions. It was a rare phenomenon, but not impossible. 18 minutes to impact. The responsibility was crushing. If he was wrong about the false alarm, a nuclear weapon would soon explode somewhere in Soviet territory, possibly killing thousands. The government would blame him for failing to provide adequate warning. He would face execution for treason and cowardice. But if he was right about the malfunction, his silence would prevent an accidental nuclear war that could destroy most of human civilization. Millions of children in both countries would live to see another day. The choice seemed obvious when viewed from that perspective. More phones began ringing as other military installations detected the same warning signals. Ground-based radar stations were scanning the skies for confirmation of the incoming missile. Fighter jets scrambled from airfields across the Soviet Union. Nuclear submarines received coded messages to prepare for possible retaliation strikes. The machinery of nuclear war was grinding into motion based on the decision Petrov had not yet made. He thought about his wife and young daughter waiting for him at home. They had no idea that their husband and father was wrestling with the most important decision in human history. If he chose wrongly, he might never see them again. The world they lived in might simply cease to exist within the next few hours. 15 minutes to impact. Colonel Sidorov reached for the red phone himself, but Petrov blocked his hand. "Wait," he said. "Give me one more minute." The two men stared at each other while chaos erupted around them. Other officers were shouting updates from radar stations and demanding authorization to alert Moscow. The weight of command pressed down on both colonels as they realized that their next action could reshape the entire future of humanity. Petrov made his choice. "I am not reporting this," Stanislav Petrov announced, his voice cutting through the chaos in the command center. "This is a false alarm." Colonel Sidorov stared at him in disbelief. "You are gambling with the survival of the Soviet Union." "I'm preventing World War III," Petrov replied firmly. He pushed the red phone away and turned to address the room. "Continue monitoring all systems, but do not escalate this alert. I believe we are experiencing a technical malfunction." 14 minutes until the supposed missile would strike Soviet territory. Around the command center, junior officers looked back and forth between their two superiors, unsure which orders to follow. The computer screens continued flashing their urgent warnings while sirens screamed overhead. Everything in the room demanded immediate action, but Petrov had chosen to do nothing. The next few minutes crawled by like hours. Every second that passed without reporting the attack violated standing orders and military protocol. Petrov's career was already over if he was wrong. His life might be forfeit as well, since failing to defend the motherland during wartime carried the death penalty. But he held firm to his conviction that the computers had made a mistake. As the minutes ticked away, he watched the technical displays more carefully, looking for any clues that might confirm his suspicions. The infrared readings remained strong, but something about the trajectory seemed off. A real intercontinental ballistic missile would follow a precise arc calculated to maximize range and minimize defense opportunities. The object the satellites were tracking appeared to be wobbling slightly in its path. 10 minutes to impact. The secure phone lines continued ringing as Moscow demanded updates. Petrov instructed his communications officer to report that they were investigating anomalous readings and would provide more information shortly. It was a delaying tactic that bought precious time while risking severe punishment for insubordination. Ground-based radar stations across the Soviet Union were scanning the skies frantically, trying to acquire the incoming missile on their own. Sensors. These installations represented a backup confirmation system that should detect any nuclear weapon approaching Soviet airspace. If a real missile was inbound, multiple radar sites would track it independently of the satellite network. 8 minutes to impact. Still no radar confirmation. Colonel Sidorov paced behind Petrov's console like a caged animal. "The radar stations should have acquired the target by now," he muttered. "If this missile exists, where is the ground confirmation?" Petrov felt a surge of hope. "Exactly what I was thinking, sir. A ballistic missile traveling at that speed should be visible to multiple tracking systems by now. The fact that ground radar has found nothing supports my assessment of a false alarm." "Or the radar systems are malfunctioning as well," Sidorov countered. "We cannot assume that multiple systems would fail simultaneously. 5 minutes to impact." The tension in the command center had reached unbearable levels. Several officers were openly sweating despite the air conditioning. Phone calls from higher command grew more insistent and angry. Petrov could hear shouting, voices demanding to know why no attack report had been filed. Then, without warning, the computer screens erupted in even more alarm signals. The satellite network had detected 4 additional missile launches from American bases in North Dakota, Wyoming, and Missouri. According to the early warning system, a massive nuclear strike was now underway with 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles heading toward Soviet territory. "Now we must report," Colonel Sidorov shouted. "5 missiles constitute a clear attack pattern." But Petrov remained calm. The new detections actually reinforced his belief that the system was malfunctioning. The additional missiles had appeared on the screens in a perfectly timed sequence exactly 2 minutes apart. Real nuclear launches would not follow such an artificial pattern due to the complex logistics of missile preparation and launch procedures. Moreover, if the United States was really launching a nuclear strike, they would fire hundreds of weapons simultaneously, not just 5. The American nuclear arsenal contained over 10,000 warheads deployed on land-based missiles, submarines, and strategic bombers. A limited attack with 5 missiles would accomplish nothing except guaranteeing total retaliation from Soviet forces. 3 minutes to impact of the first missile. Petrov made perhaps the most important phone call in human history. He dialed the direct line to his superiors in Moscow and reported that the early warning system was experiencing a technical malfunction. Multiple false signals were being generated by unknown causes, but there was no evidence of an actual American attack. The response was immediate and furious. High-ranking generals screamed at him through the phone, demanding to know how he could ignore clear evidence of incoming nuclear weapons. They accused him of cowardice, treason, and dereliction of duty. Some threatened immediate court-martial and execution. But Petrov held his ground. He explained his reasoning about American nuclear doctrine and the lack of ground radar confirmation. He pointed out the suspicious timing of the additional missile detections and the overall implausibility of such a limited attack. His analysis was logical and calm, even as senior officers threatened his life. 1 minute to impact. The command center fell silent, except for the electronic beeping of computers and the distant hum of air conditioning. Every person in the room stared at the countdown displays, knowing that they were about to discover whether their colleague had saved the world or doomed their nation. 0. No explosion. No flash of nuclear fire. No incoming reports of destruction from Soviet cities. The first missile had failed to arrive at its predicted impact point. 4 minutes later, the second phantom weapon also failed to materialize. One by one, all 5 supposed nuclear missiles proved to be electronic ghosts created by malfunctioning computers. The silence in the command center was deafening. No nuclear explosions had shattered the morning calm. No radioactive clouds drifted across Soviet cities. The 5 American missiles that should have arrived by now simply did not exist. Stanislav. Petrov had been correct. The early warning system had suffered a catastrophic malfunction that could have triggered World War III. But his relief was short-lived. Within hours, teams of investigators descended on the facility like angry hornets. The Soviet military did not appreciate officers who ignored direct orders, even when those officers turned out to be right. Petrov found himself facing intense questioning about his decision to disregard the computer warnings and violate established protocol. The interrogation room was stark and cold, with concrete walls and a single harsh light hanging overhead. 3 senior officers sat across a metal table from Petrov, their faces showing no emotion as they reviewed his actions minute by minute. Colonel General Viktor Kozlov led the inquiry with the methodical precision of a surgeon. "You understand that your failure to report the attack could have resulted in nuclear weapons detonating on Soviet soil without any defensive preparation," Kozlov stated flatly. "Your duty was to relay information, not to analyze it." Petrov straightened in his chair. "Sir, my duty was to serve the Soviet Union and protect our people. Reporting false information would have caused us to launch our own nuclear weapons against innocent American civilians. The resulting war would have destroyed both nations. The computers indicated maximum confidence in their detection. You chose to ignore sophisticated technology in favor of your personal opinion. This represents a dangerous precedent, that could encourage other officers to second-guess critical systems. The computers were wrong, as subsequent events proved. If I had followed standard procedure, we would have launched nuclear missiles based on false information. Thousands of innocent people would have died for no reason. The questioning continued for 8 grueling hours. The investigators examined every aspect of Petrov's background, looking for signs of disloyalty or foreign influence that might explain his reluctance to report the attack. They scrutinized his family connections, his political beliefs, and his previous military record. Some suggested that his hesitation indicated sympathy for the Americans or cowardice in the face of nuclear war. Meanwhile, engineers worked frantically to determine what had caused the early warning system to malfunction. The investigation revealed that sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds had indeed created false infrared signatures that the satellites interpreted as missile launches. The angle of the sun at that specific time and date had aligned perfectly with the orbital position of the monitoring satellites, creating a rare but disastrous optical illusion. The technical explanation vindicated Petrov's instinctive analysis, but it did little to improve his situation. Soviet military culture valued obedience above independent thinking. Officers were expected to follow orders without question, especially during potential nuclear crises. The fact that Petrov had made the correct decision actually made his insubordination more dangerous in the eyes of his superiors. If every officer decides to ignore established procedures based on personal hunches, our entire command structure will collapse, General Kozlov warned. Nuclear warfare requires precise coordination and instant responses. There is no time for individual analysis during a crisis. The investigators also worried about international implications. If word of the incident leaked to Western intelligence agencies, it would reveal critical weaknesses in Soviet early warning systems. American military planners might exploit this information to design attack strategies that could confuse or blind Soviet defenses. The entire nuclear balance between superpowers depended on each side, believing that the other possessed reliable detection capabilities. Petrov was eventually cleared of charges of treason or foreign espionage, but his military career was effectively over. He was quietly reassigned to a research position, far from any operational responsibilities. The official record described the incident as a routine technical malfunction that was properly handled according to standard procedures. No mention was made of his crucial decision to ignore the computer warnings. For the next several years, Petrov worked in obscurity while the world remained unaware of how close it had come to nuclear destruction. The Soviet government classified all details of the incident at the highest security levels. Even Petrov's own family knew nothing about his role in preventing World War III. He carried the secret alone, unable to share his experience with anyone. The psychological burden was enormous. Petrov often lay awake at night replaying those terrifying minutes in the command center. He wondered what would have happened if he had been less experienced or more willing to follow orders without question. A different officer might have immediately reported the attack, triggering automatic retaliation sequences that could not be stopped. Sometimes he calculated the death toll that his decision had prevented. Nuclear exchanges between the United States and Soviet Union would have killed hundreds of millions of people within hours. Radioactive fallout would have contaminated vast areas of both countries for decades. Other nations might have been drawn into the conflict, spreading nuclear destruction across the globe. The weight of these thoughts pressed down on him like a physical force. He had saved the world, but nobody could know. He was a hero whose heroism had to remain forever secret. The very nature of his achievement meant that it could never be acknowledged or celebrated. As years passed, the Cold War began to thaw. Relations between the superpowers gradually improved as new leaders came to power in both countries. Arms control treaties reduced the numbers of nuclear weapons, and communication channels helped prevent dangerous misunderstandings. The risk of accidental nuclear war slowly decreased, but it never disappeared entirely. Petrov watched these developments with mixed emotions. He was glad that the world was becoming safer, but he also knew that similar incidents could happen again. Computer systems would always be vulnerable to malfunctions, and human operators would always face the terrible responsibility of interpreting ambiguous information during crises. someone else might not be as willing to trust their instincts over technology. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and with it crumbled the Soviet Union itself. Stanislav Petrov watched the collapse of the system he had served his entire adult life with a mixture of sadness and relief. The Cold War that had nearly destroyed the world was finally ending, but the transition brought chaos and uncertainty to millions of people. Petrov found himself struggling to adapt to the new Russia that emerged from the ashes of the Soviet system. His military pension was barely enough to survive on as the economy collapsed and inflation destroyed people's savings. The research institute where he worked closed down due to lack of funding. At age 50, he faced an uncertain future with few marketable skills beyond his expertise in nuclear weapon systems. For several years, he worked various odd jobs to make ends meet. He drove a taxi through the streets of Moscow, repaired television sets in people's homes, and even sold vegetables at a local market. The man who had prevented nuclear war found himself struggling to pay rent and buy groceries. It was a bitter irony that someone who had saved hundreds of millions of lives could barely support his own family. The secret of September 26, 1983, remained locked away in classified government files. Petrov could not even put his most important achievement on job applications or explain to potential employers why his military career had ended so abruptly. As far as the world knew, he was just another retired Soviet officer trying to survive in post-communist Russia. But secrets have a way of eventually coming to light. In 1998, 15 years after the incident, details of Petrov's story began to leak out through former Soviet officials who were writing memoirs about the Cold War. Western journalists picked up fragments of information and started investigating. Slowly, the full story of how one man's decision had prevented nuclear catastrophe began to emerge. The first newspaper articles about Petrov appeared in small publications that specialized in military history. Most people dismissed the stories as sensationalized accounts of Cold War paranoia. The idea that the world had come so close to nuclear destruction seemed too dramatic to believe. Surely the safeguards and protocols would have prevented such an outcome, people reasoned. But as more details emerged and official documents were declassified, the reality became undeniable. On that September morning in 1983, the fate of human civilization had indeed rested in the hands of one Soviet officer who chose to trust his instincts over his computers. The margins for error had been terrifyingly thin. International recognition came slowly but steadily. Petrov received invitations to speak at conferences about nuclear safety and Cold War history. Academic researchers interviewed him extensively about the technical details of the early warning system and his decision-making process. Peace organizations began honoring him as the man who had prevented nuclear war. In 2004, the Association of World Citizens awarded Petrov their World Citizen Award for his role in preventing nuclear catastrophe. The ceremony took place in New York, and for the first time, Petrov found himself being celebrated as a hero, rather than treated as an insubordinate officer who had violated protocol. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience of diplomats, peace activists, and journalists, Petrov felt overwhelmed by the attention. For over 20 years, he had carried the burden of that day alone. Now suddenly the world wanted to hear his story and thank him for his courage. "I was just doing my job," he said simply. "I analyzed the situation and made the best decision I could with the information available. Any reasonable person would have done the same thing." But the audience knew better. History was full of examples of people following orders without question, even when those orders led to disaster. Military culture specifically discouraged the kind of independent thinking that Petrov had demonstrated. His willingness to take responsibility for such a momentous decision, knowing that he would face severe punishment if he was wrong, represented extraordinary moral courage. The documentary, The Man Who Saved the World, premiered in 2012, bringing Petrov's story to an even wider audience. Viewers around the globe learned about those terrifying minutes in the Soviet command center and the split-second decision that had preserved civilization. The film sparked conversations about nuclear safety, the dangers of automated weapons systems, and the importance of human judgment in military affairs. Petrov also received recognition from his own country. In 2013, 30 years after the incident, he was awarded the Dresden Peace Prize by German officials who credited him with preventing nuclear devastation in Europe. Russian President Vladimir Putin publicly acknowledged Petrov's service, though. The Russian government remained somewhat ambiguous about officially endorsing his actions. The international attention brought some financial relief to Petrov's later years. Speaking fees, book royalties, and donations from admirers helped improve his living situation. But he never became wealthy from his fame, and he continued to live modestly in a small apartment outside Moscow. More importantly, the recognition validated the terrible burden he had carried for decades. Petrov no longer had to keep his story secret or wonder whether he had made the right choice. The world had confirmed that his decision to prevent nuclear war was not only correct, but heroic. The isolation and uncertainty that had haunted him for so many years finally began to lift. Yet even as he enjoyed his newfound status as a global hero, Petrov remained haunted by how close humanity had come to destruction. He used his platform to warn about the continuing dangers of nuclear weapons and automated defense systems. The world still possessed thousands of nuclear warheads, many of them controlled by computer systems that could malfunction just as his had in 1983. "We were very lucky that day," he often told audiences. But luck is not a strategy for preventing nuclear war. We need better communication between nations, more safeguards against false alarms, and ultimately fewer nuclear weapons in the world. What happened to me could happen again tomorrow. As Stanislav Petrov entered his 70s, he became increasingly reflective about his extraordinary life and the moment that had defined it. The man who had once faced the loneliest decision in human history now found himself surrounded by admirers from around the world who wanted to understand how he had found the courage to trust his judgment over technology when the stakes could not have been higher. In interviews, Petrov often spoke about the psychological toll of carrying such a monumental secret for so many years. The knowledge that he had prevented nuclear war was both a source of pride and an enormous burden. He wondered constantly about alternative timelines. What would have happened if a different officer had been on duty that day? Someone less experienced or more willing to follow orders without question. "I think about those other possibilities more than I probably should," he admitted to a journalist in 2015. "In most of them, the world ends on September 26, 1983. Hundreds of millions of people die in nuclear explosions, and many more die slowly from radiation and starvation. Civilization collapses and humanity might never recover, all because of a computer glitch and one person's decision." The weight of that responsibility had shaped every day of his life since 1983. Petrov developed a deep appreciation for the fragility of human existence and the thin threads that separate survival from extinction. He marveled at how ordinary people went about their daily lives without realizing how close they had come to annihilation, and how close they still remained as long as nuclear weapons existed. Despite his fame as the man who saved the world, Petrov remained humble about his role in history. He insisted that he had simply done what any rational person would have done when faced with contradictory information during a crisis. The real heroes, he argued, were the engineers and diplomats working to reduce nuclear arsenals and improve safety systems so that future incidents could be prevented entirely. But historians and peace researchers disagreed with his modest self-assessment. Studies of military culture and decision-making under pressure suggested that most officers would have followed protocol and reported the apparent attack. The combination of factors that led to Petrov's correct decision, his technical background, his analytical personality, his willingness to accept responsibility, and his moral courage, represented a rare convergence that might not occur again in similar circumstances. As he aged, Petrov became increasingly concerned about new nuclear threats emerging in the 21st century. More countries were developing nuclear weapons, including some with unstable governments and primitive safety systems. Cyber attacks could potentially disrupt early warning networks, creating false alarms that might trigger accidental launches. Terrorist organizations actively sought to acquire nuclear materials for weapons of mass destruction. "The world is becoming more dangerous, not less," he warned during his final public appearances. We have more nuclear weapons in more hands, controlled by more computers that can make more mistakes. What happened to me in 1983 was not a unique event. It was a preview of disasters that could happen again and again unless we change course. Petrov also worried about the gradual forgetting of Cold War lessons as younger generations came of age without experiencing the nuclear terror that had defined his era. Young people who had grown up after the fall of the Soviet Union often had difficulty understanding how close the world had come to destruction during the 1980s. They took peace for granted in ways that his generation never could. In his final years, Petrov worked with peace organizations and nuclear safety experts to document the technical details of the 1983 incident and extract lessons that could prevent future close calls. He provided detailed descriptions of the early warning system's vulnerabilities and the decision-making pressures that military officers faced during nuclear crises. This information became part of training programs designed to help future personnel handle similar situations more effectively. The Soviet officer who had once faced court-martial and career destruction for refusing to report a nuclear attack found himself consulted by governments and international organizations seeking to improve nuclear safety protocols. His experience became a case study taught in military academies, diplomatic schools, and conflict resolution programs around the world. Stanislav Petrov died peacefully in May 2017 at the age of 77, 4 months before his death became public knowledge. He had lived long enough to see his story become part of the historical record, and his decision recognized as one of the most important individual actions in human history. The man who had started September 26, 1983, as an obscure Soviet lieutenant colonel, ended his life as a global symbol of moral courage and rational decision-making under impossible pressure. His legacy extended far beyond the single moment that made him famous. Petrov's story became a powerful reminder that individual choices can alter the course of human history, even when those choices seem small at the time. He demonstrated that technology, no matter how sophisticated, remains fallible, and that human judgment continues to play a crucial role in matters of life and death. Perhaps most importantly, Petrov's experience showed that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary moral courage when circumstances demand it. He was not a superhuman figure or a specially trained hero. He was a middle-aged military officer doing his job during a routine shift. Yet when faced with the most consequential decision imaginable, he chose wisdom over protocol, analysis over obedience, and humanity over doctrine. In a world that still bristles with thousands of nuclear weapons and countless opportunities for miscalculation, Stanislav Petrov's story remains more relevant than ever. He proved that one person's clear thinking and moral courage can indeed save the world, but also warned that we should not depend on such individual heroism to protect us from our own destructive capabilities. The mission that day in 1983 was supposed to be one way toward global nuclear destruction. Instead, one man's refusal to accept that fate changed everything.